Hey there, welcome to Intro to Creative Writing. In this video, I'm going to be introducing you to the world of writing and sharing all the things that I wish I had known when I started writing my first novel. Some of the things you'll learn today are the myths and truths about writing a novel, the difference between literary and commercial fiction, an overview of the writing, editing, and publishing processes, how to make a living as an author, where to find a writing community, and more. I've also created a free workbook for you, which includes all the information on the slides from this video, a bonus glossary of writing terms, and questions to help you get a sense of direction for where you want to go with your writing. I'll leave the link for the workbook below this video, so make sure you grab that before we get started. So if you don't already know who I am, my name is Caitlin, and I'm a young adult writer and founder of inkandquills.com. I've been writing novels and studying fiction for over 10 years now, and I also have a bachelor's in creative writing and history. Story is what I'm really passionate about, and I'm here because I want to help you learn how to write amazing stories that win the hearts of readers and publishers. So now that we've been introduced, let's go ahead and get started. So I want to start off by debunking some myths about writing a novel, because I feel like new writers come into this with a lot of unrealistic expectations. I don't want to discourage you or be a downer. I just want to provide you with the facts so that you know what to expect and you can figure out if writing a novel is right for you. So myth number 1 is that writing a novel is a great way to make big money. The truth is, you're not going to make a lot off of a novel unless it becomes a bestseller. For a first-time author, your advance is going to be somewhere between $5,000 and $10,000. This is going to depend on the size of the publisher and also the audience you're writing for, whether you're writing a children's picture book or a middle grade or young adult novel. It is possible to make a full-time living as an author, and we'll talk more about that later, but you need to realize that writing a novel is definitely not a get-rich-quick scheme. There's a lot of work and time that goes into it. So if you're looking for a way to make a lot of money fast, writing a novel is definitely not for you. Myth number 2, writing a novel will make you famous. The truth is, you're probably not going to get recognized in public unless you're J.K. Rowling. Most readers don't remember authors' names or even know what they look like. You'll be lucky for your readers to remember your characters' names, much less yours. Myth number 3, writing is easy for writers. This is absolutely not true. Writing is really, really hard even for writers. You have to pour so much of yourself mentally and emotionally into your writing that it can become exhausting. Ernest Hemingway said that there's nothing to writing. All you have to do is sit down at a typewriter and bleed. And it's so true because you're pouring your heart and soul into this story, and it just takes so much of yourself. If anyone tries to tell you that writing is easy or there's nothing to it, they're either lying or trying to sell you something. Myth number 4, writers always feel inspired when they write. This is so not true. I know that most days I don't feel inspired when I'm writing, and I have to drag myself to my desk and force myself to work on my story. And I know that sounds kind of weird because writing is something I love to do, but it's also work. When you first get that new idea for a story, everything's exciting and you're on this high, but then once the newness wears off, suddenly it becomes a chore and it starts to feel like work. If you're wanting to write professionally and become an author and do this as a living, you have to learn how to discipline yourself to write even when you don't feel like it. Because if you only write when you feel like it, or when you're feeling inspired, you're never going to finish your story. Myth number 5, since you wrote a book, it must and should be published. The truth is that most writers' debut novels aren't the first one that they've written. My debut novel will actually be the 4th book that I've written. That's because your first few novels are usually what I call practice novels. It's where you're learning how to write and you're figuring out how story works. With each novel you write, you get better and better until you finally write something worth publishing. So just keep in mind that you don't have to publish every book you write. So, now that you know the fact and fiction about writing a novel, you might be wondering, if you can't get rich and famous and it's so much work, then why do writers write? One reason that writers write is because it's a passion and a way of expressing yourself. For me, I'm constantly writing stories in my head, and it's just instinctive for me and how I'm wired. If I don't get those stories out onto paper, it drives me crazy, and I need that creative release from writing. Some other reasons for writing might be to help influence and shape the world, because the writer loves to write and making art for others to enjoy, to share something like truth or ideas or an experience, to challenge people's perceptions or make people think, to help people understand themselves in the world, or to offer people an escape from the world and create characters they can relate to or look up to. I write because it's something I love to do, and I want others to experience and enjoy my stories because I feel that stories help you understand the world and they make you feel a little less alone in it. I want you to ask yourself, why do I write? Why do I want to write this novel? Writing a novel is a long, difficult process, and knowing your why is going to help keep you motivated and help you keep going when you want to quit. So you've decided writing a novel is for you, but you're confused on where to begin. How do you learn to write a novel? Usually, when you want to learn something, you have someone teach you how to do it. I think this is why I've had people ask me, do you need a degree to write a novel? No, absolutely not. You don't need a degree or a license or anyone's permission to create art. And that's one of the things that I love about writing. It's something anyone can do, whether you're a waitress, a soldier, or a mailman, it doesn't matter. Publishers don't care about your education. All they care about is whether or not you have the ability to write a good story that they can sell. So how do you learn to write a novel? There's several different options, which I've listed here in order from the least to the most expensive. Teaching yourself by reading articles and books on writing and just practicing writing novels is going to be your cheapest option. This is actually how I learned to write. I taught myself by reading books on the topic because I'm a really independent and driven learner. This might not work for everyone, especially those writers who like to have more support. Now, another option, which is in your mid-price range, is to look for online or in-person courses and workshops on writing. This is going to be a better option for writers who need or want more support or guidance and don't like self-teaching. Your next and more expensive options are going to be your one-on-one services like coaching and critiques. These are great because you get to work closely with an experienced, knowledgeable writer, and they're going to personalize their services to fit your needs and look at your weak points and your strengths. The drawback to this service, though, is going to be that this sort of individualized help is going to be more expensive. And of course, the last and most expensive option is going to be getting a creative writing degree from a program at a university. Now, I did study creative writing at the university level, but honestly, most of what I learned, I taught myself from reading books on writing and then applying what I learned and practicing by writing novel after novel. So you don't have to spend a bunch of money to learn how to write. All of these are great options, and it doesn't really matter which you choose. Any of these will teach you to be a great writer. Basically, what you want to look for is just look at your learning style and your budget and figure out which of these is going to work for you. So you might be thinking, all right, well then why can't I just learn by practicing and writing? You can, and that is going to be the best way for you to learn. But the thing is that when you learn from other writers, who are more experienced and have gone through this, and they've made those mistakes already, and they've figured out what works and what doesn't work. When you learn from them, rather than trying to figure it all out on your own, whether you're learning this from books or a class, it's going to help you become a better writer faster and achieve your goal of writing a novel faster. So before you can start writing your novel, you first need to understand why readers read. This was something that I did not understand when I first started, and I really wish that I had, because I feel like it makes you look at your story differently, and it gives your writing more purpose and direction. I used to think that we just read for entertainment, but now I know that although that is a reason, it's not the only one. The main reason that we read is to connect emotionally to another person and share their experience, whether that person is real or fictional. Now, some readers might be aware of this desire for an emotional connection with a story, and others might not. But deep down, it's something that we all want when we open a book. And if you think about it, it makes sense. The stories that stay with you are going to be the ones that made you feel something, whether it made you cry or laugh. The ones where you were really able to get into what the character was feeling and experience the story along with them, those are the books that are going to stick with you. Now, when you're writing, remember that readers are going to come to you looking for that emotional experience, and it's your job to provide that in your story. Another thing you need to understand before you start writing your novel is story itself. Now, that might seem kind of weird because you're probably thinking, of course I know what a story is. I've read dozens of them. The problem is, reading a novel is completely different from writing one. When you're reading a story, you get so distracted by your emotions and the events that are taking place in the story that you're blind to how the story works. You can't see how the author has constructed it or the techniques they're using to make it feel real. Now, when I first started writing, I used to think that a story was just made up of exciting events. I thought in order to write a good story, I just needed to think up a bunch of cool action scenes or sword fights. The problem was, I was left with a bunch of random, disconnected scenes, and the story was all over the place, and it ended up being a lot longer than it should have been. I didn't realize that for a story to work and not be a collection of random events, it needed certain ingredients. Those ingredients are a hero, a goal, a plot, villain or opposition, and change. Once you have all those ingredients, you then need to take them and put them into a basic story structure. That structure looks something like this. A story is about someone, the hero, who wants something, the goal, sets out on a journey to attain it, plot, faces obstacles, villain or your opposition, and grows or learns something along the way, change. Now, when you start to understand this structure, you'll start to notice that this is the basic foundation of every book and movie that you'll come across. And once you start using this structure, your own stories will start to have more direction and look like actual stories. And it will make the writing process so much easier. Now that we've covered why we read and what a story looks like, I want to start getting into some writing terminology. One term you're going to be hearing a lot in the writing world is word count. So what is word count? Well, in the publishing industry, agents and publishers measure the length of a novel by its word count, not its page count. Why do they do this? It's because page count can be deceiving. The type of font you use, the font size, line spacing, and page margins, this can all add to or subtract from the number of pages in a novel. On the other hand, word count doesn't lie, and it will always be an accurate way to measure the length of a novel. So, how long is a novel in word count? Novels are a written work that are 50,000 words or more. The length of a novel is going to depend on the age of the audience you're writing for and also your genre. So for example, a young adult novel will be longer than a middle grade novel, and sci-fi and fantasy stories tend to be longer than contemporary stories because of all the world building involved in fantasy. Now, don't worry if none of this makes sense to you right now. It took me a while to be able to understand the size of a book from word count. Now, I always use word count to measure my stories. And when people ask me, how long is your book? And I say, oh, it's around 70,000 words. I don't even think about it because it makes sense to me now. But then I'll get this blank look from people and they'll say, oh, so how many pages is that? And then it's my turn to have the blank look because I have no idea because I don't even pay attention to page count anymore. So don't worry, you'll eventually start to get a feel for word count. But to help you start to understand word count versus the size of a book, here are some examples for you. So first we have The Fault in Our Stars, which is a young adult contemporary novel, and it's around 67,000 words. Then we have the first Harry Potter book, which is actually middle grade, and 77,000 words is pretty long for a middle grade novel, but since it's fantasy, it's okay for it to be a little longer. So then we have The Hunger Games, which is young adult fantasy, and it's almost 100,000 words. And then last we have the last Lord of the Rings book, The Return of the King, which is adult fantasy, and it's 134,000 words. And this is a really high word count for fantasy, and that's because this is what they call high fantasy, which is really detailed world building and very complicated plot. So those types of fantasy stories are going to have the 100,000 plus word counts. So one more thing I think it's important to note is that there's no perfect word count for a novel. Sometimes writers think bigger stories are more impressive, but a longer story doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be better. I want you to just focus on using however many words it takes to tell your story, whether that's 50,000 or 100,000. One of the first things you want to do when you start writing a novel is to figure out who your audience is so you know who you're writing for. There are several different categories in fiction broken down by age group. You have children's, which is ages 1 through 7, middle grades, ages 8 through 12, young adult, ages 13 through 18, new adult, which is 20s through college, post-college age, and this is actually a newer category that's just appeared in the last few years or so. And then finally you have adult fiction, which is 18 years and older. So it's important to know what audience you're writing for because the market for each of these categories is different. They have different expectations about what your story should and shouldn't have, and also the needs and point of view of each of these age groups is going to be different. So for example, sex and swearing is okay in a young adult novel, but not in a middle grade novel. And whereas a young adult novel deals with themes about growing up and learning who you are and finding your place in the world, adult novels are going to deal with themes that are more mature because an adult character has already figured these things out. So you want to understand what the do's and don'ts are for your audience and what publishers expect so that you write a book that's appropriate for the market and that they can easily sell. Another writing term you're going to hear a lot is genre. Genre is basically a specific type of story. So for example, my audience is young adults, and the genres I write are historical fiction and fantasy. So which genre should you write? I don't think any one genre is better than another, but some are more popular with readers than others. The best-selling fiction genres are mystery, thriller, and crime, fantasy and sci-fi, modern and classic literature, and romance. Because these genres are popular, they can be a good way to break in as a new writer, but don't feel like you have to write one of these genres. always write what you love, no matter what the market says. So, besides these top genres, other genres in fiction include adventure, drama, contemporary, fairy tales, historical fiction, horror, humor, magical realism, and westerns. You can also mix genres together and create something completely new. So, for example, you can mix together historical fiction and fantasy, or western and science fiction. Whatever genre you choose, you want to read as many books in that genre as you can so you understand what readers expect in these types of stories and also what competition is out there. So another way of categorizing a novel is with subgenre. A subgenre is a specialized subcategory within a genre. So for example, you have the genre of fantasy, but then within fantasy, you have subgenres like dystopian, high and epic fantasy, urban fantasy, steampunk, time travel, paranormal fantasy, etc. Another example is within the genre of romance, you have subgenres like chick lit, historical romance, contemporary romance, romantic comedy, military romance, western romance, and so on. A lot of times, writers will tend to stick to one genre or even just one subgenre that they get comfortable with, but don't be afraid to branch out and experiment. So far we've talked about age categories, genre, and subgenre. But there's one more way of categorizing fiction that I want to talk about before we move on. This is the difference between literary versus commercial fiction. Most writers fall into the commercial fiction category, but I think it's important to understand the difference between the two. So, with literary fiction, it's written chiefly as art or to explore the human condition, whereas commercial fiction is written mostly as entertainment. With literary fiction, the focus is more on the internal conflict of the characters, but with commercial fiction, the focus is more on the external conflict of the plot. With literary fiction, the emphasis is on character development, and with commercial fiction, the emphasis is on the character achieving a goal. With literary fiction, it uses beautiful artistic prose, whereas commercial fiction uses clean, simple writing. And lastly, literary fiction is slower paced, and commercial fiction is faster paced. Additionally, there are also books that are hybrids and contain elements of both literary and commercial fiction. I am definitely a commercial fiction writer, but for the longest time, I was holding myself to the standards of literary fiction. And since these standards weren't expectations in my market, I was basically beating myself up about my writing for no reason. You can still write a great story without beautiful prose, but the most beautiful prose can't save a terrible story. So no matter whether you're writing literary or commercial fiction, make sure you know how to tell a good story above all else, because at the end of the day, that's what really counts. Next, I want to talk a little bit about the writing, editing, and publishing processes, so you know what these look like and what to expect. First off, I want you to understand that every writer's writing process looks a little different, and the more you write, the more you're going to figure out what does and doesn't work for you. But this is a pretty typical outline of how the writing process unfolds. So first, you start with the pre-writing stage. This is where you find your idea and then develop and expand that idea, outline your plot, world build, develop your characters, etc. This is also when you'll do most of the research for your story. Once you have all that together, the next step is to start writing your first draft. This draft doesn't have to be pretty or perfect. You're just trying to get everything out of your head and onto the paper, and you want to write it as quickly as possible. The last step in this process is revising. This is where you write additional drafts that address plot holes, rearrange events, add, remove, or change scenes or characters, and any other big changes you need to make. Now, the number of drafts you write will vary, but most writers end up with at least 3, including that rough draft. Once you've finished revising and making all those major changes, it's time to move on to editing. The editing process focuses on making small changes, like checking for grammar and spelling errors, fixing typos, fine-tuning sentence structure and pacing, and so on. Somewhere around this point, you might also want to think about sharing your novel with beta readers. A beta reader is someone who test reads your story and tells you its strengths and weaknesses and suggests improvements. You can then use that feedback to make any additional changes that your story might need. I tried using beta readers for the first time with my current novel, and I was so nervous about it at first, but it turned out to be such a great experience. The feedback that I've received has been so helpful, and I feel like it's made my novel 10 times better than what it was before. I know it's scary to let others read your work, but I would highly recommend trying to get over that fear and give beta readers a try because they can really help you improve your story. So you've drafted, revised, and edited your story, and now you're ready to release it into the world. But just how do you go about getting a novel published? You have 2 options. You can either self-publish, or you can publish traditionally. I'm going to talk about traditional publishing because that's what I'm familiar with, but self-publishing is another option you might want to consider, and I'll include some resources for that in your workbook as well. So, how in the world does traditional publishing work? The process might seem confusing or intimidating at first, but I promise once you start to understand it, it's really not so bad. The first thing you need to know is that getting published traditionally isn't easy. Publishing is a business, and agents and publishers are looking for stories they can sell. If they reject your novel, it might not be because it's a bad story, but because they don't think they can sell it. Harry Potter was actually rejected by multiple publishers because they didn't think that they would be able to sell the story. So try not to take rejection personally. Now, your first step in your publishing journey is to get yourself a literary agent. Why do you need a literary agent? Well, most publishers nowadays will only allow you to submit your story if it's being represented by an agent. This practice started because publishers were getting so overwhelmed by submissions. Agents help save publishers time and work by sorting through thousands of submissions, finding the best ones, and then sending those on to the publishers. To get an agent, you'll need to send out what's called a query letter, which describes what your story is about. If an agent is interested in your story, they'll ask to see more. And if they like what they see, they'll agree to represent you. So once you've snagged yourself an agent, you can then start submitting to publishers. Once you find a publisher who wants to buy your story, your agent is going to help you negotiate the contract so you get the best deal. Also, I want to point out real quick that agents don't get paid until you do. So if an agent ever tries to get you to pay them up front, it's probably a scam and you need to run away as quickly as possible. So after you sign your contract with a publisher, you'll then work with the publishing house editors for further editing of your novel. The publisher will also design a cover for your novel, discuss marketing strategies, set a release date, and send out advance copies for review. So, how long does this whole process take? It can take you months to find an agent, and the time between signing your publishing contract and seeing your novel on store shelves can be a year or longer. That's right, it can take over a whole year. Traditional publishing is a really slow process, but if it's your dream to see your novel in bookstores, the wait and all the trouble will be well worth it. Getting a novel published isn't easy, But I don't want that to stop or scare you. If traditional publishing is your dream, I want you to have the confidence to go after it. So now we're at the part you've probably been waiting to hear about, getting paid as an author. You've probably been wondering, is it even possible to make a living as an author? It is, but I'm not going to lie to you. It's very difficult and it takes time. And in a moment, you'll understand why. First, let's talk about advances. The average advance for a first-time author is somewhere around $4,000 to $10,000. This number is going to be based on the size of the publisher, the type of book you're selling, and how well the publisher thinks it might sell. Now, $4,000 to $10,000 might sound like a good number, but the thing is, you don't get to keep all that money. You have to pay taxes on it, and you also have to pay your agent. Agents usually receive around 15%, and this includes your royalties as well as your advance. The other thing you need to know about your advance is that you're not going to receive it all at once. You'll get half of it when you sign your contract, and the other half when you turn in your edited novel. Are you beginning to see why making a living as an author isn't easy? Well, what about royalties? Before you receive any royalties, your book first has to pay back your advance in sales. That's where your advance came from. You were being paid royalties in advance. Sometimes, if a book doesn't sell well enough to pay back its advance, it won't make royalties. And since the publisher is losing money, there won't be any royalties for the author to receive. If your book sells well and pays back its advance, the average royalty rate you'll receive for a hardcover novel is 15%, and for a paperback novel, it's going to be around 7.5%. So, how is it even possible to make a living as a writer with numbers like these? To make a livable income from your writing, you're going to need to establish a career as an author. This means constantly writing books. The more books you get out onto the market, the more royalties you'll collect and the more advances you'll receive. If your books do well, the size of your advance will probably increase too. The thing is, it's going to take time to write all those books and build up your publishing career. So in the meantime, you're probably going to need to hang on to your day job. But even though becoming a full-time author is hard, it's definitely not impossible. So as you've seen, writing a novel and getting it published is a lot of time and work. There's also a lot of struggles involved, which is why it's best not to do this alone. I highly recommend making friends with other writers who will support and encourage you and understand all the joys and challenges that go along with writing a novel. So where can you find other writers to connect with? One option is Twitter and Twitter chats. There's a couple Twitter chats that I know of for writers. The first one is #StorySocial, which takes place on Wednesdays at 9 p.m. And the second one is #StoryCrafter, which takes place on Sundays at 8 p.m. GMT. Another place to look is at writing challenges like NaNoWriMo and Camp NaNoWriMo. NaNoWriMo stands for National Novel Writing Month. This one takes place in November and it challenges you to write 50,000 words in a month. Camp NaNoWriMo takes place in April and July and it challenges you to write a story of any word count within that month. You can sign up for accounts on both of these websites, and this allows you to become part of a writing community and access forums where you can talk to other writers, and also you can create writing groups once you start to make friends. Another place you can look is on websites like Wattpad and Moviellas, which are places that allow you to share your work with others and comment on other people's work and also receive comments on your work. So websites like that also usually have some forms built into them where you can go and chat with other writers and meet people and make friends. So for the longest time, I actually didn't have any writer friends. It wasn't until I started blogging that I started meeting other writers and having that support and community. And that has made such a huge difference in my writing life. It's so much more fun to write a novel when you don't feel like you're alone and you can share the experience with others. I know as writers, we tend to be a little introverted, but I'd really like to encourage you to get out of your comfort zone and seek out other writers. Writing might be a solitary task, but it doesn't mean that you have to do this alone. So I hope that you found this video helpful and that all this information makes your novel journey a little smoother and easier. If you're wondering where to go from here and you want to learn more about writing, I'd recommend checking out my Writing 101 series. This series goes over all the basics of writing a novel, like characters, plot, and dialogue, and it's perfect for writers who are just starting out. You might also want to check out my ebook/workbook, Zero to Story, which walks you through the process of finding an idea and expanding it into a short story or novel. And of course, get out there and start writing novels and getting that hands-on practice and experience. Thank you so much for watching, and I wish you all the best as you set off on your writing journey.